Okay, so just touching base with logistics. So this is the fall exam schedule. And this shows that test will be on December 10th. Okay. So the test will be online. It will be 2 hours. It will be 50 questions, all multiple guess. Okay. So you'll be able to calculate your grade immediately at the end and know what your grade is going to be. We will just use that one position paper as your grade for your group project. There'll be an online analysis of your members you can take, and it's anonymous. So basically just touching base with that. If anyone needs any changes, please let me know, because I know exams can get all bunched up sometimes. Okay. All right. Yes.
Are you dropping an exam grade?
Yes, we're going to drop one exam grade. Okay, the lowest. So I've had a couple of you that were just simply unable to take the other tests. So that's, you just drop that grade, and it's just 3 out of the 4, the top 3 out of 4. Okay. Yes.
Can you tell me exactly?
It is period time 8 to 10:30, so it'll open up at 8, close at 10:30. There'll also be a 3-question bonus unit that you can take if you want to. It'll be worth 2 points apiece. It'll open up for 2 minutes, and it'll be just like the bonus points I have. And so it's a possible 106 out of 100. Okay. So we'll follow exactly that time frame. All right. Already did that. Okay. So we started talking about managing channel conflict. We talked about the stages of conflict. And now we're going to talk about the sometimes benefits that you get with it. So one of the things I wanted to show you also is, many of the times we use things that we talk about in practical actually come from genuine theory. So the modern era of relationship marketing, this was one of the bellwether articles. It came out in 1994, and it's by one of the marketing immortals by the name of Shelby Hunt. And so the era of relationship marketing showed that there were 2 vital components of being able to have long-term relationships. This also is something that we talk about with conflict as well. And the 2 things that are important are commitment and trust. And we're going to talk about both of those. Before I go on, though, I kind of wanted to show you, we're not just using words that we make up. This is actual research that's done about functional conflict. And we'll talk about functional conflict in a second. But what it says is that you can positively affect a reasonable way of getting along if you trust one another. And it sounds simple, but those are basics that need to be in one way or another confirmed. In science, you never prove anything. You confirm things. In other words, what you consider to be principles and those things, but science has a way of moving on. And so basically, yes, we confirm that functional conflict is an idea that really exists, and we study it. So with all of that going on, let's talk about this thing. We talked about how we measure it, but we talk about functional conflict as a way of improving channel performance. And so what this means is that before we go off, it's important to understand that there can be positive benefits from conflict. All right, not in its worst scenario, but functional conflict. If you have trust in each other and you're willing to voice your disagreements with each other, can actually be a good thing. I fly a fair amount and I'm addicted to watching the airplane crashes stuff. And some of the scenarios that they come up with is cockpit management, the ability for the first officers to tell the captains that they're doing something wrong. That is vital. It is important for members to talk to each other. Otherwise, we have difficulties being able to fix things. In the early parts of World War II, on Imperial Japan's side, there was the difficulty of being able to accept that people were making mistakes because that was a loss of face. Well, guess what? Sometimes the grandfather clause doesn't work. You got to tear up new ground. And when you do that, guess what? You bump into each other. But if you can recognize each other's contributions, you understand that success depends on each other, then you can oppose each other without damaging your arrangements. All right. Success depends on communication, our ability to express ourselves in ways that can be understood. And so you can talk about points of opposition. You might perceive the conflict, but if there's genuine commitment and trust together, you can live past it. And there are a lot of things that I can think of, like errors, especially in sports, that required changes in conflicts in the way things went. And overall, there was success. Okay. Channel members can prod their partners to achieve better results with a functional conflict. And disagreements can be channeled through constructive ways. And at the end of this particular chapter, we'll talk about how do you have practical ways to manage conflict. Now, having said all of those wonderful things, we can also say that it can be horribly bad. If it goes sideways, it can be really bad, okay? And this is what manifest conflict is. So the first video we had, I showed you the wheel of conflicts, all right? Think of all of those as being functional until you get to this one, the last one, which is not. And this is when you have tension and frustration and anger. You actually reduce an organization's satisfaction with you. You damage the long-term relationships. And ultimately, those things diminish trust. And if you don't have trust, then you do not have the ability to be able to handle conflict. This becomes, as I said, part of organizational memory. It is literally passed from employee to employee as things go on. And it is a situation that simply requires one way or another for those two particular parties to get rid of each other. Big point, we don't need to minimize conflict. We need to be able to manage it. You have to manage conflict. You expect that it's there. It is perhaps an unnecessary evil, but how you get to the other side of it can determine whether it's success or failure with the organization. So, what are the major sources of conflict? Where do they come from? So, we've been talking about this since the very start. The intermediaries and the consumers, because the consumers perform channel functions. Realize that these two individuals have very similar goals, and these are different in the middle, and that's a good place to start, just by the very nature. And so the first are the major sources of conflict. The first is competing goals. The manufacturer wants to be able to sell in as many as he possibly can, or they possibly can, in as many outlets as they possibly can, and the consumer wants the exact same thing. Because the consumer with multiple outlets, they can be picky about the things, how they want it delivered, and price as well. The intermediary wants to be able to control the flow, especially when it is in their geographic area. They want to be able to handle distribution of that particular type of product or good for whatever they consider that domain to be. The manufacturer says, why do you have so many of my competitors on the shelf? There's less room for me. The intermediary says, well, actually, I do pretty good because I provide a wide selection, so you actually sell more. Different realities. The manufacturer might say, look, I'm letting you stock those things on my shelves. Why aren't you putting up my ad signs next to the shelves? And the intermediary says, well, that's not your place. That's not your domain. That's my domain. And I consider this to be the best way that I can arrange my particular store. Now, when there are multiple, if you have many channels, then you start to even have competition over customers, and that can quickly, very quickly turn into conflict. Why did you open another outlet here? I got this one covered. Well, no, the whole area is growing, so everybody's going to be able to get a certain amount. Those are many times some of the major places. We also have to know the competing goals, as I just talked about. Each side has a different way of thinking, but it also goes beyond just that. So has anybody touched in IO Psych, if any of you have taken the classes, have you talked about agency theory yet? So if you get into industrial organizational psychology, this is going to be a big thing for you to remember and understand. So what does it mean? So let's see. This is agency theory, and let me select that. This is agency theory, all right? So the agency theory says that there's two actors in any situation. One who's called the principal, and the other who's called the agent. So agency theory states that the principal hires and assigns the work to the agent. The agent performs that work on behalf of the principal and returns the results to the principal. So what it basically says is this is the basic realities if you particularly work at any organization. Agency theory is one of those things that makes all offices flow. The principal expects the agent to act as a representative of the principal's goals and ideals, but the agent has other reasons why they're around. And because of these competing and different goals, this is one of the issues that brings up and creates conflict. So the work creator gives the work to the agent, whom the principal delegates the work. And basically what happens is there are just simple divergences of goals. They're moving in different directions. And you will be on a personal journey that will be a different direction many times from the companies that you work. And yet you are a representative of that organization. So there is the expectation to deliver goods or work, regardless of where your situation is. Okay? Yeah, just to explain what the office is like. Okay? But this is kind of it, and think of it in this way, all right? So the manufacturer is going to have the expectation that my intermediaries are going to work in a given way. The intermediaries say, I want to be able to cover an area and have as many as I can. Just divergent goals, all right? Doesn't mean that they're in opposition with each other. It's just that we're moving in different directions. And so, along with that comes the differing perceptions of reality. We live much ways in very different worlds, and we speak in different ways, and finding sometimes a common area in which we can get along can be awful difficult. And if you think that's bad in domestic markets, it's much more prominent in international settings where there is a very large difficulty in between cultures. So to give you an idea, when I taught in South Korea, and I taught there for 6 weeks. I taught a master's class, and at the very end of it all, so South Korea is a very structured nation. It has, very much hierarchical structure, not unlike Scandinavian countries as well. The only way that they feel like they can get to know you is to get bombed off your gourd. And eventually, when you've had enough to drink, they think that's the time that they get to really know you. Scandinavian countries are the same way, very hierarchical structures like that. There needs to be an excuse to be able to let off steam. Well, in the last week, they wanted to take me out. I mean, I'm their teacher. And I went along with them, but I wasn't going to drink that much. We both had differing perceptions of reality. And it's important for you to understand, have greater sensitivity for the people you're trying to communicate to. And it makes life a lot easier, all right? Just realize that we all live in our own perceptions of reality, and how we manage those things ultimately can determine success or failure. Intra-channel competition, and there's nothing you can do this. The suppliers, especially if their products are shopping products, there's very little that you can do about it. Other than taking your particular product field and creating broad assortments across it. So what you can do is be able to bring all of that particular class of a product, let's just say like it's earbuds, and rule in that particular group. But you want to be able to have as many things as you possibly can. The downstream, there's a conflict. I rely on various competitors to sell their products. I want to be able to be intensive in my area. And so this is the three major places where conflict comes. And then also let's talk about multiple channels. We suffer right now from channels in what's called channel pollution. And it is quite simply that wonderful device called the cell phone, or the smartphone, if you wish, has basically taken and created so many different routes from the consumer from beginning to end that many times it's very difficult to study it and understand it. And so along with that, the advances that have made it easier for you to be able to coordinate has made it more difficult for us. Suppliers and customers like multiple channels. Suppliers want to increase penetration. Customers want more ways of getting the goods. And yet, as we know, efficient channels have more members. And so you have this thing going on. So what do we do about it? So downstream members may lose their motivation. They may exit it completely. It makes me want to reduce the amount of depth for my supplier because I'm not getting out of it. And consumers move from one category to another. This generation is probably which is good, the most fickle generation there is because you have so much information. And you tend to make, I would say, better decisions because you have more information. But it makes it heck for us to try to catch up. So, are there ways in which you can actually go through this in multiple channels without increasing conflict? And the two biggest ways, if you're in growing markets, it doesn't matter. You can add on multiple channels, as I said, and ultimately the number keeps growing. The other is that if your particular products are perceived to be differentiated, unique, and separate, and many times, especially within electronics, there's multiple categories that carry that. But the truth is that channels flow as they wish, where consumers want to go, which is really a good thing. So, multiple channels do not automatically compete, especially when the multiple channels are going after different market segments, which is one of the things I talk. Multiple channels are also good because they can build primary demand. IMC, integrated marketing communications, means exactly that. Integrated marketing communications, and you communicate through the channels of distribution as much as you do anything else. So Coke, when they came out with vending machines, they were rejected by supermarkets in the 30s and 40s. The reason why is that the supermarkets demanded, why would we be selling Cokes inside when they can get them outside ice cold? And the answer is, it's two different sets of consumers. One wants to bring a bunch down back to their home. Another one is in an impulse buy just because it's hot. And so they don't automatically compete. And they can, as I said, build primary demand. You start a store campaign and a direct marketing campaign, and basically those work together through greater channels, and they can overall achieve a faster demand. So it requires a lot more managing. And the suppliers have to decide how much they need to protect from each other and how do they gain some kind of cooperation. Well, and not only that, but who gets to hand out their products too? I mean, which corporations get the best, and, or let's just say the most complex and the less complex is another decision that has to be made. You may have product lines that are not sufficient to be sold online. I'm not sure I want to buy a chainsaw online. Not really sure. Maybe not a diamond ring either. So what you do find as a solution is they will set up multiple channel strategies. So I've talked about this before. Apple sells its MacBook Pro line through universities and through Mac stores. Walmart sells the iPads, the iPhones. I was about to date myself. I was about to say iPod. But it sells all of its other categories through Walmart, which is a very smart decision. It's the largest retail vendor in the United States. And so this is a two-tiered system. You have a flagship through one line, and then you sell it in another way. And so these are ways that you can stop conflict. We have one other member or one other difficulty when it comes to distribution, and it's what's called the gray market. So when I worked in Lafayette, Louisiana, I was a store manager for a computer store. We had a school, Fatima, that bought everything from us when I was working at the computer store. Everything. So they wanted to buy, at that time, they had a library of about a dozen Commodore 64s. They were very efficient little machines. You could get one for less than $500. Include all of that with a disk drive, and there was some really good stuff that was learned from it. Anyway, they wanted to buy them from us. We were not an authorized dealer. And so what they did was we bought through a store in Houston, which gave us a 10% markdown, an authorized distributor, and then we sold those goods to Fatima. This is what's known as the gray market. So the gray market is authorized branded products sold through unauthorized distribution channels. These aren't knockoffs and they're not fakes. These are the real deal, but not sold through the original distributors. Now, these are not arbitrageurs. The arbitrageurs are professional traders that make money just by transporting items. So I'm going to show you something. This is a very bad drawing of the China and Indochina there. You have Taiwan over here. So at Hong Kong, what you have is, so in China, you cannot get the same type of iPhone that you can get in the United States, all right? So what happens is this, there's an arbitrage in Taiwan that flies, let's say 100,000 iPhones over to the island of Taiwan, and they turn around and relicense them back, go back to Hawaii and pick up a 10% profit just in moving the goods from one place to another. And that's what a professional trader does, is they buy huge amounts in one market with low prices, and they transport them to other markets with high prices. Or when it's in locations where it's not authorized, it all finds a way. The difficulty with the gray market is there's really no victim, all right? The supplier is selling exactly what they want to sell, or even more. Let's put it that way. And so the supplier is succeeding, the consumers are getting their goods. And so is there any particular damage? There is tension, okay? So when there's different pricing between channel members or in geographic markets, that introduces gray market goods. It means that an area like Japan, where I can buy these goods enormously expensive, an arbitrager can buy them through a dealer like in Indochina, ship them to Japan, sell them for 20% less and still make a substantial income. And this is where gray markets get iffy, because they are a source of conflict. They perceive them differently. And as a downstream member, you can say it's unfair. But as long as there are economic reasons for this, it's going to go on. And like reasons like us, they trusted us. We worked on their Nintendo 64s, even though we weren't authorized. So those are the kinds of things that happen. And so, how do we minimize conflict? Well, the first way that we minimize conflict is not surprising. You know, first thing is we avoid conflict. It should be managed, but make sure that it doesn't go too far, because conflict will create conflict. And once it starts, it's very difficult to overcome. And remember that everything you do in your organizations, you're building a memory path. And that organizational memory, those things that go on, they linger. and acrimony will develop. And there'll be the anticipation that even though you've had trust there, you're not really sure what the other party is going to commit to. So the first thing you do is you stop making threats. I mean, that's kind of a, big surprise there. If you want to increase channel conflict, threaten someone. Because not only does it imply punishment or negative sanctions, but we perceive that as a threat to everything. And so, yeah, very simply, just reduce the number of threats and you're going to be fine. Relationships do not succeed long-term unless there is some balance of power between the groups. There's no way to purely balance strength against strength because everybody has their own unique strengths. The best of success is when each side is differentiated and there are alternatives. And when they're both powerful and they're intolerant of coercive tactics. Balanced relationships will not allow it. And so the danger, of course, is imbalance, okay? So if I'm an intermediary or if I'm a dealer, I am always vulnerable to this kind of thing. And so how do I deal with it? Well, most of what happens with that, especially, as I said before, is you just accept. I mean, it becomes just a way of life. You can pound the table very vigorously and vent if that makes you feel any better. What will normally happen as an action, along with passive acceptance, is there's going to be some deliberate neglect. You will basically reduce your priority. You'll cut back on resources. You'll keep it on the line because you need that. But as far as putting your best effort into it, you're not. They say threatening to stop selling the line, but it almost seems to me like complaining vigorously they do the same thing. Or the last thing that you can do is you can attempt to create some kind of way of creating functional conflict. You come up with a way of discussing this in some way that you can try to find some mid-ground. And you know what? I've been in situations where it doesn't work, but it's the last step sometimes. So, one of the other points about conflict is how you are treated. Are you treated fairly? And how do we even define fairness? Well, there's two concepts or ways in which to be treated fairly, and this will be on your test definitely. One way is what's called procedural fairness. This is also called procedural justice. You might even see that one versus the other. Procedural fairness or justice. Procedural fairness means you're being treated fairly in a day-to-day situation or in a day-to-day environment. So every day you're being treated fairly, all right? Another way that we are treated fairly by actions is what's called distributive fairness. This can also be justice as well. And this is being treated fairly in compensation and rewards. These are outward actions which show us that the party that we are dealing with is treating us fairly. Procedural fairness, am I treated well and respectfully in my day-to-day activities? And then distributed fairness of justice, am I treating fairly in compensation and rewards? Perceived unfairness is relationship acid. It exerts the greatest negative impact on cooperation. Because if we are perceived as being treated unfairly, it is a natural reaction to resist. Perceived unfairness aggravates the negative effects of conflict. It creates opportunism, the willingness to move to another channel partner. And once you are perceived as being unfair, it's very difficult to get back. When you have unfairness, the individual members perceive of things internally. And we all know what that means. We take it in and it affects us. We look at all motives by the sellers as to take advantage of us. And it is only natural when being threatened, or especially when we perceive we're being unfair, being treated unfair, we seek retribution. And this is where you get the organizational activities, actions, and reactions, and they spill over and they don't stop. And so, perceived unfairness, it is the worst effect when it comes to cooperation. So how do we find ways of resolving conflict? What are our strategies? There are active things, just as we talked about the ability to use power. There are abilities that we have to resolve conflicts. So, the best way that we have to resolve conflict is to accept that conflict exists and institutionalize it. We come up with ways in handbooks and in guidelines that come up to address conflict in their stages. And so what happens is you normalize it. You make it part of your everyday. You also join joint memberships in things like trade associations that become like third parties to help us mediate or to be able to transmit information and differences between each other. As a matter of fact, the concept of a third party becomes even more important when we take on such ideas as mediation and arbitration. And these are things that you do when both sides can't come up with a reasonable way to survive. So, one of the things that you can do is share an intensive amount of information. And yet, the sharing of information is one of the most trustful things you can do. The willing to be able to give up trade information can be vital. Mercedes-Benz willingly gave up the patent on the triple connection seatbelt because their whole point was it's there to save lives. So that's an example. There are many groups, especially like that, when it comes to standards, especially like engineering. We don't have to see any more buildings collapse. The joint memberships are ways that we can institutionalize differences and come up with an approach to resolve conflict. So there's some times when there's nothing we can do. And so you're trying to stop conflict from exploding into manifesting. And maybe at some point it's actually past that and it is manifest, but you've got to find a way to be able to get together. And so the first way is mediation, which is the Star Trek way, where the mediator is a third party that comes in to settle a dispute. They don't really have any powers. But what they're hopefully able to do is find some combination, some commonality between the two disputed parties to be able to come up with at least some form of agreement. Now, mediation has no power whatsoever. It is only there as a guidepost to be able to try to create a conversation. Arbitration, however, does. Arbitration, usually, especially compulsory arbitration, usually associated with industries in which there's a vital national interest. And so arbitration is automatic in several of the railroads and the air traffic controllers. Those are considered in the national interest. And so those cannot strike unless extreme emergencies. And so they use compulsory arbitration. So how does it work? Compulsory arbitration takes the decision away from both parties, and the judge is the one, whoever it is, who decides. And so, as I said, compulsory arbitration, generally it's associated with communications. It's also associated, like I said, with railroads, air traffic controllers, vital national interest. Voluntary arbitration is when both sides are at the very edges, but they can't live without each other. And so the parties voluntarily submit their dispute to a third party whose decision is final and binding. Now, here goes back to the Curt Flood story that I started Thursday last week. Anyway, so Curt Flood, baseball player for St. Louis Cardinals. The system that they had in Major League Baseball was they owned your career as a baseball player, the teams. They had the rights to be able to write their own contracts. You did not have the ability of going anywhere else. Curt Flood in 1969 filed for free agency. It effectively killed his career, but he brought free agency not only to baseball, but to other sports as well. But it was limited. Fast forward 1992 baseball strike, it got rid of, or it basically, there were 100 games lost during the major league season. The baseball players were trying to strike for true free agency, and the owners would not budge. And after half a year, the players were desperate to get back to work. And they came to Marvin Miller, who was their lawyer, and said, can we at least get something? And Marvin Miller said, why don't you give us voluntary arbitration in case we don't come up with a salary? And the baseball owner said, deal. So has anybody got an idea of what baseball salaries have been like in the last 30 years? Or athletic salaries have been like for the last 30 years? High. Anybody want to know or guess? I think the highest salary right now is 120 million. Okay. Why? Because in that situation, it is obvious that a judge is going to know that for decades, they've been held back. Generally in arbitration, usually the player always wins, and he should, all right? I mean, Babe Ruth said he made $150,000 a year, and we're talking about 1925. They were angry at him because they said, the president doesn't make that much money, and Babe Ruth said, yeah, but I had a better year. So anyway, arbitration, voluntary, compulsory, it works. So the other way is we build relational norms. We make it part of the fabric of walking in every day and making it a way of doing these particular things. We are flexible. We are willing to at least listen and consider other possibilities. So flexibility becomes important. The ability to exchange information with each other and the need to be able to exchange information in a successful way. And then finally, there's solidarity within the organization and between the organizations. We try to encourage the players to refrain from being coerced. We try to make an effort to work through their differences. Relational norms in any organization start at the top. It's the only place that they can succeed at. And so if you're going to have these things, you have to have a clearly expressed statement by the senior members in the organization. If you have that, you can make relational norms work. So, other ways that we can go about resolving conflict. I'm sure we've all used these at least once, every one of them. So the first is avoidance. And this is the willingness to agree with any or all conflict by agreeing to any. This is how I work with my daughters. Thank God for mom. Because I'm pliable. Anyway, the other is we try to captivate dependence in our channel partner by inviting and showing trust, accommodation. Someone has to make the first move. And so we strengthen the relationship by being willing to give up a little something. In a zero-sum game, basically, it's every person for themselves. This is Hangman in Maverick, Top Gun Maverick. You pursue your own goals. It's whatever you consider to be success. It's a very short-term way of living, but if you're in a short-term environment, then it's the way that it works. Compromises is when you try to press for solution and get to be able to get each side to achieve its goals, but realize that any compromise requires not a total victory. Compromises work. They may not even resolve things, but they get you to the other side. And then problem solving is the most difficult. It seeks to get it all. You try to recognize each other's goals and your counterpart. And you try to be able to work in a complex way to be able to achieve success. So I've said before, mine is problem solving, but winner take all. I think once one or more of us in our family, those that argue best, are the ones who get it all. And I think that's the way it should be too. If I don't care enough to really argue about it, I don't care at all. It's all or nothing. It's either dead stop or speed of light in a vacuum, one or the other. Okay, so conflict resolution styles. And then finally, remember that appealing to an individual's economic self-interest is a very highly effective way to settle. Dude, if we just get past this, you're going to get a 20% bonus of like $6,000. Can't we just figure out a way? Yeah, economics, hit people where they live, folks, in their pocketbook. When I owned a store, my benefits were always cash. There's nothing that's more beneficial to a person when they get $400 bills. I believe that motivates better than anything else. They do more than offer a better price. They can have a portfolio of elements that can be a financial returns that spread to every channel part. We're all going to get rich. But the problem is that they can be difficult to administer because once again, this is a reward power, and rewards have a way of multiplying. So sometimes it can even be pretty difficult to be able to keep all the incentives down on a certain list. So use it, but sparingly. Okay, so we're finished chapter 11, and I'm just going to briefly start on chapter 12, and then we're going home for Thanksgiving. Well, you're going with me. All right. Did I not put that there? Maybe I didn't. No, there it is. Never mind. Okay. All right. So in the age of artificial intelligence, personal and human relationships are more important than ever. I've talked often about our sales program here. Generally, our sales employees have a job, or excuse me, our sales candidates, our undergraduates have a job 6 months before they ever get out of school. I think more than anything else, the human element is just going to become more important. And I think it still will, and even more as time goes on. And there's reasons why it's becoming more important than ever. The first is that, as I've talked about, channels are very much service related. All right. When we talked about warehousing, and I talked about wholesaling, excuse me. When I talked about wholesaling, I talked about Moody Price. The services that they delivered were more important than the materials that they gave. And I think that will continue. Service matters more. We also have an aging population, a shift of purchasing power, and we're quite simply in an era of global competition and commoditization. We know this also, that the number one impact in integrated marketing communication is personal selling. So the personal touch does more business than advertising does. And so relations and relationship is more important than ever. Relationships provide connections. They bind organizations. They are enduring and they are substantial. There's many ways that we can talk about it. In chapter 1 and 2, we talked about relational governance. We talked about that also in the vertical markets when we were talking about that organizations act as if they are one organization even though they have different balance sheets and different reasons for being in existence. Relationships matter. They connect and they keep us bound. Now, the difficult, of course, thing with that is there are advantages for that binding as well. But let's talk about one of those first things that we talked about when we talked about Shelby Hunt was that concept of what commitment is. So commitment and trust were primary drivers for functional conflict, long-term relationships, and overall satisfaction in the relationship itself. And so commitment exists when one organization desires to be with that other organization in an indefinite way. And it's really hard to talk about. It's an attitude, it's an expectation. There's the belief that the partner is going to be there. And in truth is, relationships can be encumbering. They impose obligations on both partners, but they have benefits. And the benefits outweigh whatever the other things that you have to give up in order to have them. Sounds like Dr. Bill done. Anyway, but that's the truth, and that's how relationships are, okay? They impose obligations on them, but they have real benefits and they have real costs. And relationship, the commitment and the long-term willingness to stay with that person indefinitely or that organization creates an advantage. So what are the parts of commitment? How do we see what commitment is? Commitment first has a long time horizon. You realistically can't conceive of being without that particular partner. You are willing to make sacrifices in order to maintain and expand the relationship. And the sacrifices are augmented by benefits that make the sacrifice worthwhile. Even things like gratitude, which is in very short supply. And there's the active desire to keep the relationship going. There is no, in essence, there's no sundown date. Although you can build one in, especially in the short term. That happens quite a bit. But asymmetric commitment is not like asymmetric power or conflict, okay? Commitment is total. You can have asymmetric commitment, but it doesn't last long, okay? And so we'll end with this one. We seek relationships to motivate their members. They hope them to be able to coordinate our marketing efforts more tightly and directly. Remember, it's that concentrated use of force that makes success. If I can get investments that help create additional value, if I can provide some unique education to my downstream partners, unique enough that I'm not telling others, that helps create additional value. And the long-term benefit is that it becomes a better barrier of entry against future competitors. It basically says, we're willing to be together in this, and we're going to stay this way for a long time. Procter & Gamble and Walmart have had a long-term commitment for decades, and they continue to do so. We'll talk about it on Tuesday next week, but Walmart has an office inside of Procter & Gamble, and Procter & Gamble has an office inside of Walmart. And there's reasons why you do that. They have to come down to relational norms. Okay, we're done. Yes, there's some other people up there too, but yeah. If you see her in a bar, buy her a beer. I see you up there too. Have a good day.